Okay. All right, should we get started?
Yes.
On the depressing topic of fetal personhood as a threat to women's sovereignty. Who here is already familiar with the concept of fetal personhood? Everybody? Okay, yeah. We'll get started. And I just wanted to start saying I want to dedicate this to Amber Thurman, who lost her life due to the Georgia abortion ban, the state we're in right now, and to all the countless women over the ages who have died due to abortion bans. Abortion bans kill women. So this is from I used to have an organization called Personhood for Women until it got transjacked. But we were all about spreading the word that in the United States, women do not have full constitutional rights. The 14th Amendment that grants equal protection under the law that was ratified and became federal law in 1868 happened at a time when women didn't have constitutional rights and weren't considered persons. We were considered mostly property to the men in our lives. We couldn't own property in many states. We didn't have federal rights. And that remains true. And then the Equal Rights Amendment was an attempt to remedy that on the part of first wave feminists. And it was first introduced in 1923 by Alice Paul and a group of first wave feminists, and was actually passed by Congress in 1972, but was never ratified. So women don't have full constitutional rights in the United States. And in a Supreme Court decision in 2011, Antonin Scalia actually said the 14th Amendment does not apply to women because we were not persons at the time of its ratification. And we right now have a Supreme Court that has many judicial scholars that are considered strict constitutionalists who would agree with Scalia on that. An example of this is the Hobby Lobby decision from, I think it was 2011, where the Supreme Court ruled that it was legal for companies to exercise religious freedom to deny coverage for birth control and contraception and abortion to their employees. And it says right in the ruling, it only applies to women's health because men are covered by the 14th Amendment. So they specifically say Jehovah's Witness-owned company cannot refuse to cover blood transfusions because men are affected by that, but they can restrict our rights because we don't have full constitutional rights. So this is a really important issue. It's a huge thing. So we're not legally persons, but right now the shift in the anti-abortion movement has been to attempt to give full acknowledged legal personhood to fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses in a country where the women in which those beings reside do not have constitutional rights. So it's kind of dire. The state I live in, New Mexico, actually has a really good equal rights amendment that was passed not long after Alice Paul introduced this. Like, New Mexico became a state in 1912, and I think our equal rights amendment came through in like the 40s. And it has been interpreted over and over and over again to protect women's reproductive sovereignty. So in New Mexico, you cannot you can't force a woman to have a cesarean with a court order. Women cannot be criminalized for any behavior during pregnancy that someone might think is harming a fetus. So I live in a state that is literally proof that the ERA would protect women. And give us full legal personhood. Most women do not. So let's talk about this whole concept of fetal personhood. Abortion was banned in the United States in the late 1800s when doctors were consolidating as a practice and trying to criminalize all their competitors. The AMA formed in the late 1870s. And their main competitors were midwives, homeopaths, herbalists, snake oil salesmen, like people. This is a time before antibiotics, before safe blood transfusions. The allopathic doctors who became the AMA really didn't have a safety advantage over anybody else, but they wanted to be the only group of medical providers. So they went state to state trying to criminalize their competition. And the midwives were enormous competition because they wanted to take over birth, because birth is the initiatory experience into the world, and that's how you capture all of healthcare, by capturing birth. And so they knew they couldn't do it by criminalizing women attending other women's births, but they went after abortion, and they made abortion illegal state to state. But these were framed as like moral laws about women's behavior and about babies being the property of husbands. There was no concept of the rights of the fetus at the time. This is before ultrasound technology. This is a time when you didn't even consider the pregnancy real until you could feel the baby moving, like 20 to 24 weeks. So there wasn't any like fetal rights movement going on. It was strictly about control of women's behavior. But in 1884, there was the first recorded legal decision on fetal personhood, where someone harmed a pregnant woman and the fetus died, and the representatives of the family of that woman tried to say that there had been harm to both the woman and the fetus, and the Supreme Court of Massachusetts ruled a fetus is not a legal person. And then again in 1900, the Supreme Court of Illinois ruled that a plaintiff can't seek legal damages for injuries that occurred in utero. This was actually someone trying to sue their mom for behavior during pregnancy that they felt had led to their palsies, their issues. And the Supreme Court of Illinois said you can't get damages for something that happened to you when you lived inside another person.
Wow.
So this was brewing for a while. In 1908, the New Hampshire courts ruled that no damages could be collected for injuries to a fetus. 1927, the Louisiana courts ruled that a woman can't recover damages for injuries that resulted in a stillbirth because a fetus is not a legal person. 1969, we're getting close here to, this is when the fight for legal abortion is really ramping up. The New York court rules that a stillborn fetus is not legally a deceased person under the state wrongful death laws. And then in 1973, we have the Roe v. Wade decision, which obviously we all know was just overturned with the Dobbs decision in 2022. And we grieve the loss of Roe v. Wade, but we need to remember Roe v. Wade was actually a really terrible compromise for women, and it was very much more about protecting physicians' rights to perform abortion than a woman's right to have sovereignty over her own body. If you read the legal, you read the ruling itself, it says over and over again, this is a decision to be made by a woman and her doctor, a woman and her doctor, a woman and her doctor, and it says a doctor cannot be held and criminally responsible for an abortion. Nowhere in Roe v. Wade did it give women the right of sovereignty to their body, and the ruling declared that a person under the 14th Amendment does not include embryos and fetuses. But what it did not say was a person under the 14th Amendment includes women. So we didn't get personhood through it, but fetuses didn't either. And in the Blackmun decision, Harry Blackmun, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, actually introduced the concept of fetal personhood to the world in that decision, saying, should in the future laws be passed that say embryos, fetuses are people, that would nullify this ruling. Because again, it did not give women bodily sovereignty, and it did not say women are people under the 14th Amendment. It just specifically said embryos and fetuses are not. So the anti-abortion movement jumped on that. Here's Blackmun's statement. If this suggestion of personhood is established for the fetus, the appellant's case, of course, collapses, for the fetus's right to life would then be guaranteed specifically by the amendment. So fetal personhood, the concept, in a country where women don't have legal personhood, essentially relegates us to being state-regulated incubators throughout pregnancy, literally, right? Because we don't have constitutional rights, but I do believe the life of the human organism starts at fertilization. I think it's kind of crazy not to acknowledge that, but I believe that you can't give rights to the fetus without negating the rights of the woman. And I will always be on the side of the human that's already here in relationship with us, already existing. It is her right to bodily sovereignty. And I think the state can, I think we need to get rid of this idea of arguing about whether or not a fetus is a human being and say The state can't force one human being to be an unwilling life support system to another human being. That's what we're talking about. But the men making these laws are pretty clear that we're not legally human beings. Like, they're clear about that. Look at this. This is pretty amazing. So Blackburn introduced this concept to the anti-choice movement. And so Roe versus Wade was, the decision was ruled on January 22nd, 1973. 8 days later, the Hogan Amendment was introduced in Congress in an attempt to give constitutional rights to fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses. It did not pass, but that's how fast they were on it. Let me just grab my water here. And this has been the shift since, to try to codify legally that the unborn, like we're seeing all these laws where they actually use the phrase unborn children. The unborn are full people with constitutional rights. So things, for that first decade after Roe versus Wade, there's a lot of organization happening. The anti-abortion forces were really consolidating and coming up with legal strategies. 10 years later, we had the Human Life Amendment introduced in Congress during the Reagan administration that would grant full constitutional rights from the moment of conception. But then once you're born, if you're female, no longer. It failed to pass. It's been reintroduced in Congress over 300 times since. And then when they're having a hard time getting this passed federally, even though it's the Reagan-Bush administration, so they shift to the states. And even though Roe versus Wade was really clear that the states can't restrict abortion rights, I mean, they demarcated pregnancy into trimesters. During the first 12 weeks, the state could not pass any laws restricting abortion rights. In the second trimester, there were some exceptions, and then at the point of viability, the state could act in the interest of the fetus. Even though it was clear you couldn't criminalize early abortion, the anti-abortion movement starts trying to pass all these laws, get these laws on the books to codify fetal personhood, hoping that the other track to their strategy is going to work, where they're going to bring down Roe versus Wade. So they're working on this two-pronged strategy to send it back to the states and then have the states have all these laws to say it's homicide to have an abortion. Minnesota was the first state to pass this, and it was passed in a way it was hard for people to oppose, because most people's heartstrings are pulled when they think of a pregnant woman being attacked and assaulted and losing her pregnancy, which is a huge tragedy, and that there should be extra penalties, not just the penalties of the woman being harmed or killed, that they're also killing the fetus is an extra level of harm and feticide. And I can really understand why people would be sympathetic to that, not thinking about what it means for women to be declared separate from the fetus legally. So Minnesota was the first state to pass a fetal homicide law, and then it starts taking off all over the place. Many, many states in 1987 passed these laws against fetal harm. Many of them had provisions saying that it wasn't meant to be used against women for their actions during pregnancy, but none of them said specifically they couldn't be used for actions against women during their pregnancies. They just said, we're not passing this in order to criminalize women, but they didn't specifically give women the right to be exempt from being charged under these laws. And then in 87, we start to see pregnant women being criminalized, and the state moving in and getting court orders on behalf of fetuses. And the first case, a really sad case in Washington, D.C., Angela Carter was a woman in her 20s who was dying of cancer, and she was pregnant. And she had terminal cancer that at the time could not be treated any further. And she was 26 weeks pregnant, and she wanted more life. She knew that a cesarean would kill her because she had a blood cancer that was interfering with her clotting factors. She also knew 26 weeks, not very viable. Like, those kids are not going to have a good life at that point. And she wanted to spend the end of her life at home with her husband, with her family, and die. And a Washington, D.C. court ordered that she undergo a cesarean. Both she and the baby died. And the family posthumously tried to get it overturned and to say that it had been against her rights, and it was not overturned. It was ruled constitutional that had happened to her. Really tragic, disgusting case. So things like that start happening. That wasn't, Angela Carter was not the only woman in 1987 that suffered court-ordered medical care due to states acting on fetal rights legislation. In 1988, Arkansas makes fetal homicide a crime, and the Arkansas law does not exempt women or even give any kind of language around it saying not meant to punish women. That one was pretty clear that it could be used to criminalize women who, should Roe versus Wade fall, women could be jailed for fetal homicide for attempting abortion or for using drugs in pregnancy or doing reckless things. Like one Arkansas lawmaker relatively recently said that women shouldn't go snowboarding while they're pregnant. As far as I know, I don't think there is snowboarding in Arkansas, but that was, am I wrong? I don't think the Ozarks have a lot of snowboarding. And in 1989, states begin arresting pregnant women big time for fetal endangerment. That's where we see the whole cultural mythos of the crack baby rising up. In 1989, there's this real hysteria rising up that women are using illegal drugs during pregnancy, and we're having crack babies born, these babies that are born addicted to drugs. And many states start arresting, detaining women or doing forced treatment for women for suspicion of drug use, including many women who were not actively using drugs at the time but had a history of drug use. So like if they had disclosed to a medical provider at the first appointment that in the past they had used crack cocaine or even marijuana, but now they weren't using it. Even if she did not test positive during her pregnancy, the doctors, especially in South Carolina, it was a big state for that, started arresting and detaining women for fetal endangerment over drug use, illegal drug use. I think well over 1,000 women in 1989, and it still somewhat continues to this day. And then in 1989, this other very disturbing case happened where this is not so much about fetal rights, but about women no longer having rights once we become mothers, where the state of New York ordered a woman who was a Jehovah's Witness, Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe in blood transfusions, to receive a blood transfusion after giving birth because of the overriding interest of her newly born child. So that the already born child had more rights than the woman to her own bodily sovereignty, and she was forced to get blood transfusions, which is, I'm a big believer in the First Amendment, and I may not agree with much of what Jehovah's Witnesses believe, but those are their firmly, sincerely held beliefs, and they believe they cannot be accepted into the kingdom of heaven if they have had a blood transfusion. This messed with her eternal salvation. All of her family believes that. Her child will believe that. This was a big deal to force this woman to have a blood transfusion. And again, she was not pregnant. She had already delivered. The baby's life was not in danger. And that has been, I think Lynn Paltrow took that case from the National Advocates for Pregnant Women, and the courts declared that it was constitutional. It wasn't overturned. You can't undo it, but at least we could get the precedent undone. The precedent was not. The precedent remained in New York State. And then we saw a Florida woman jailed for passing illegal substances to a minor for using drugs. So Florida didn't have fetal harm laws, but a baby was born with marijuana in the system, and they said that she had contributed to the delinquency of a minor. So that even without the fetal personhood laws, that her, that was seeing this. She didn't give the baby a joint, she was pregnant. And that's a big one because marijuana stays in your system a long time because it's fat soluble, and during pregnancy, the particular metabolism of pregnancy is very anabolic. You're building mass during pregnancy, and cannabis will stay in your system a lot longer. We do not run on ketones during pregnancy, and fat, anything that's fat soluble will stay in your system a lot longer. So she could have used marijuana months before the birth and tested positive at the time of the birth. 1996, the South Carolina Supreme Court rules that women can be charged with child abuse and endangerment for their behavior during pregnancy. And this law was used against a woman who stayed with a batterer and suffered a miscarriage after being beaten, and she was held criminally liable for endangerment of her fetus. And this has happened in custody of like already, children that exist already outside of their mothers. There have been times where courts have said, well, you went back to him, so you're the reckless one, so he gets custody.
Wait, what?
Yeah, I've seen that in my state even, that women, you've seen it, Jamie, right? Yeah, that she's held responsible for endangerment of her children for staying with a batterer, but that the laws are very clear that battering a woman does not remove a man's right to paternity and custody. So in South Carolina, many women were being charged with child abuse and endangerment for drug use, but there was a woman who was charged and convicted under this law for staying with an abuser and ending up with a miscarriage or a stillbirth because of being beaten by him. Really horrific stuff. 1998, Wisconsin, a doctor reported a woman to police for refusing drug treatment. The woman was not currently using drugs, but had a history of opiate addiction. And she had been clean for a while, according to her family and her community members. And the doctor said she needed to be placed in treatment because she was such risk of recidivism, such risk of going back to using. She was in recovery and disagreed. The physician called the police. The police arrested and detained her for the duration of her pregnancy. She was put in forced treatment.
Well, how did they find her? Like, who turned her into the state?
The doctor who had her medical records with her address on it.
Is it illegal to hold her without any charge?
Well, she had a charge that she was refusing drug treatment, and that was endangering the life of the unborn. Yeah. I'm telling you, like, we don't have rights. Like, we
also overprivilege what doctors think.
We do overprivilege what doctors think. And, psychiatry and, oh no, what happened? There we go. And obstetrics are the only two branches of medicine that can confine people against their will. They are wings of the police state in the United States. In 2000, a Massachusetts court ruled that charging a person for 2 counts of murder for murdering a pregnant woman doesn't violate double jeopardy. So we have this federal right that we can't be charged and tried twice for the same crime. Someone had killed a pregnant woman. I'm like, old school, like, tribal justice, but I do believe in the legal concept of double jeopardy. And so this man was tried twice for murdering the woman and murdering the fetus.
And convicted?
Yes. And then his appeal was that it violated it violated the double jeopardy clause, and the courts ruled that was not the case. So that's Massachusetts, a pretty liberal state, but that's what the fetal homicide law is like. And again, I can see how people are sympathetic to that, but these laws are used against women as much, if not more, than they are against people who commit crimes against us. And then in 2001, we start seeing this, what I think is a distressing trend, that states start to issue death certificates for early and mid-pregnancy miscarriage, for pre-viability miscarriages. And this just happened actually in New Mexico, which I didn't think it would ever happen. This is kind of like a backdoor personhood, where all of these women who'd had miscarriages and had all this grief, and they wanted their grief to be validated by the state, and they pushed and pushed and pushed for years to get the state to give them a death certificate for having a miscarriage. And it's, you could, again, see how people could be sympathetic. Like, you seem like a monster if you're opposing this, and there's, grieving women who are really sad about a miscarriage. But these are for pre-viability. Like in New Mexico, the compromise was 350 grams. It's like a 12 to 14 week miscarriage. That is not a viable baby. It's a tragedy. It's very sad. I have a lot of anarchist tendencies. I don't need the state to give me a certificate for anything. But like I'm not, I got mixed feelings about driver's licenses. But I could see these grieving women. It's very hard to say no to them. So now we have this issue where I practice, we have to, if a woman miscarriages in our care, we have to weigh the fetus, which often doesn't even look like a baby at that point because this can happen days and days after the baby has died. And we have to weigh, and if it's over 350 grams, the woman can't go home with the baby. Like, we have to call funeral home.
Oh my God.
And like, where there was always this compassionate, up until 800 grams before this, where you could take your baby home and bury your baby under a rose bush, and you didn't have to deal with the freaking, funeral home industry. That's a really crooked mafia industry, and now 350 grams is the ruling, and most of the funeral homes are like, oh, we'll do it for free for you, but it messes up your grief process to not have a choice over that and to have to go through this industry. And the state's giving them grants to do it for free. Like, it's just a whole other situation. So Arizona was the first to start doing that. Okay, and then in 2003, the Texas Penal Code was changed to include unborn child at every stage of gestation from fertilization until birth as a legal person and individual under the law. So they said that every fertilized egg and beyond is a full constitutional person. And then they pretty quickly put an IVF clause in there saying, oh, except IVF. Like, if the zygote's in a woman, it's a full person. But if a doctor has 500,000 of them on ice, that's fine. Though their constitutional rights aren't being violated by being cryogenically stored, but if you have a glass of wine and one's inside of you, you're going to jail. 2004, Congress passes the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, making a separate crime to kill an embryo or fetus during an attack on a pregnant woman. So now it's a federal crime. You can be charged with a felony, a federal crime for harming a pregnant woman, in addition to harming her for harming the fetus. And then 38 states quickly followed that. States that have been waiting for the feds to do something. Kentucky declares under state law, human being includes fetus, every phase of development. And then Pennsylvania rules the state can take custody of a fetus in order to force medical care on a woman. So if a woman is declined, so if you go, having a fine pregnancy, you're feeling fine, you go in for your 28-week visit, and you don't want to drink 2 cups of corn syrup to prove you don't have diabetes, they can take custody of your fetus for refusing medical care, for any medical care. And it's not just like, yeah, exactly. It's a really crazy test. And Pennsylvania is one of the states.
How do they take custody of the fetus?
By taking custody of the woman.
They put her in jail or something? I mean, what?
Well, it probably force the medical care on her. Like, most women will comply with it because the threat of it. Like, that's what I see. Is it rarely goes to the point of the cops coming in, because once you threaten that, people comply.
Yeah.
So, but if she doesn't comply, they would put her in the hospital until her pregnancy is over, and then probably take custody of her baby because she's obviously a bad mom. That's like the sick thing. And then in 2004, another very disturbing case. Melissa Rowland was a woman in Utah who was carrying twins, and she refused a cesarean during labor. She had a boy-girl fraternal twins. The boy died and the girl survived, and an hour after the birth, she was taken to a jail cell. Yeah, she's still bleeding. She's an hour postpartum. And she was charged with murder. She spent several years in jail and then finally took a plea and got time served for refusing a cesarean. This grieving mother, still bleeding, removed from the baby that she had. The baby was put in foster care. I don't think she still has, I don't think she has custody of the baby now.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and went to jail for multiple years awaiting murder charges, and then 2 years later released with time served after she took a plea.
Family support or anything? How the hell?
Yeah.
Custody family support anyway, survive.
Yeah, I know, but I'm just, that was able to go.
I
forward,
don't
which is
know
astonishing.
the details, but Utah is a big predatory adoption state. And part of that is the Mormon church, like there's a lot of pressure on wed mothers but Utah has an enormous adoption industry, so that might have played into that baby not going to family members.
That was Melissa Rollins in Utah.
Yeah, yes.
That's just astonishing.
And that's just speculation on my part, but
Yeah.
yeah.
That makes sense.
That's a whole other topic of the predatory nature of the adoption industry. 2008 was the formation of Personhood USA, which is this national organization supported by all the big, like National Right to Life, like all of the big money anti-abortion forces formed Personhood USA with the goal of passing fetal personhood laws in all 50 states and all territories. And they start working really hard at it. And then within the next three years, fetal personhood amendments are introduced all over the place. They failed to pass in Colorado, North Dakota, Mississippi, and Oklahoma, which is interesting. Mississippi had a really egregious one, and it was pretty amazing it didn't pass there. And then in 2010, another very disturbing case. Christine Taylor was a woman in Iowa who fell down the stairs when she was before 20 weeks pregnant. I think she was 16 or 18 weeks pregnant and miscarried. When she was in this small town hospital, someone who knew a friend of hers said, oh, she was saying she didn't even want to be pregnant. And she was charged with feticide, with fetal homicide for falling down the stairs and miscarrying. There was no evidence she'd intentionally thrown herself down the stairs. And she probably was having an unstable pregnancy anyway, because it's pretty hard to induce a miscarriage with that kind of trauma. But hearsay within the medical system led to someone calling a prosecutor, and she spent time in jail before those charges were dropped. And then in the same year, California charges Kelsey Carpenter with murder after her infant died at an unassisted home birth. California has, we think of it as like hippie paradise, but it has very strict medical laws. It is, the AMA is very strong. The California Medical Association also very strong. And they, when I was training as a midwife, there were many California midwives in jail for attending women's births. They were really notorious for that. We know their vaccine laws are really, really bad. You can't get exemptions at all for your children. And they will tolerate state-regulated midwives. This woman had an unassisted home birth, the baby died, and she was charged with murder. She went to jail and then she was released again with a plea with time served. That's often what happens to these women. 2011, again, that was a bad year. Alabama grants a child tax credit for stillborn infants and miscarriages over 20 weeks. Like that. That's the only state, I believe. Oh, now Georgia, they passed something, but you can't claim a federal tax credit for a stillbirth, but in Alabama and Georgia you can. And then this very disturbing case happens in Indiana. Baby Shuai, she was a Chinese immigrant who was pregnant, and I think she was 34 or 35 weeks pregnant, and her boyfriend dumped her on Christmas Eve. Her boyfriend broke up with her in a parking lot in this very awful way. And she went home and ate a box of rat poison, trying to kill herself. She was so devastated, she tried to kill herself. She immediately was like, what have I done? Like a lot of people who try to kill themselves with poisoning, she regretted it. She called friends, they took her to the hospital. Baby was delivered. The baby died like 4 or 5 days later, and it was not clear that the baby had died from the poisoning. She was charged with capital murder, facing the death penalty. She was held in jail for years and years with this capital murder charge over her. She was recently released for time served, but she spent over 5 years in prison for trying to kill herself during pregnancy. That same year, Jenny Lynn McCormick was a woman in Idaho where abortion was legal at the time but really hard to access. She lived in rural Idaho. Working class woman, unreliable transportation, couldn't deal with the Idaho abortion laws that had like these 3-day waiting periods, couldn't take time off work, so she ordered misoprostol through the mail. She took misoprostol and aborted, and then she said that she thought she was much earlier, and she delivered a fairly late miscarriage, like I think it was like 16 to 18 weeks. didn't know what to do, called a friend to help. The friend narked on her, and she went to Idaho charged her for self-abortion. She spent time in jail, and then Idaho declared it was legal to women don't have the right to self-abort in Idaho, but then the district court overturned it, and she was released. And then outside of abortion, another very disturbing case happened that year where Bode Miller, an Olympic skier, had a one-night stand with a woman named Sarah McKenna, and she got pregnant, and she decided to stay pregnant, but she did tell him she was pregnant. She probably shouldn't have. And then she moved to New York for a job. She was a firefighter, and she moved, and he sued her for transporting his child across state lines while she was in the first trimester of pregnancy. That was not ruled constitutional, but he was rich and he had all these father's rights lawyers on his side, and the second she delivered, she was served with subpoenas for custody and to ship the baby back to California. And she had to go to California for the custody hearing when she was just a few days postpartum, and he got half custody of that baby. And at first he got full custody and she got visitation because she had dared to move out of state with a man's property inside of her, and now she has to share custody with him. Really distressing case, has not been overruled like that. That's really, really concerning. Am I on time? Okay. All right, so 2013, Alabama rules that child endangerment laws written to protect children from exposure to meth labs can be used to prosecute pregnant women who use methamphetamines. So these laws were passed saying, like, if a 3-year-old's in the house and you're cooking meth, that's child abuse. Then the court ruled those same laws can be used if a woman uses methamphetamines during pregnancy, and she can be charged with child endangerment. And then in Tennessee, a woman who was pregnant was stopped at a routine DUI checkpoint. She'd had one drink. She blew well under the legal limit, but she was taken to jail for reckless endangerment of a fetus for drinking during pregnancy. Like, that's distressing, right? That's, yeah. 2014, Tennessee passes a fetal homicide law allowing women to be charged with murder and drug use for reckless behavior during pregnancy if they fail to produce a live infant at birth. Like, the law says that, if they fail to produce a live infant at birth. And then there was a case in Washington State, another state with really locked down midwifery licensure, where the licensed midwives police the unlicensed midwives and the free birthers. A woman had a twin home birth, which is illegal for the licensed midwives to attend. So if you want a home birth and you've got twins, you have to do it without a legal attendant with you. And both the twins survived and the birth was fine, but neighbors heard her in labor and called the cops. And she lost custody of her twins. She and her husband lost custody of the twins for having an unassisted home birth. And then they also took the toddler because he had eczema, visible eczema, and hadn't been to the doctor for not treating eczema, which is never a life-threatening condition. She lost custody of 3 children for refusing to comply with the medical standard of care. And the Washington midwives were split, and some of the Washington midwives were going to testify against her for her recklessness, but they backed off because other midwives disagreed with that. It's crazy. That's what happened to Janet Fraser, our sister in Australia. She wrote a book called Born Still, where she had an unassisted birth and had a stillbirth, and the midwives went after her. That was a horrible case, and she was dragged through the court system for murder. And they showed her birth video over and over again of her naked and giving birth in the courtroom. They showed it over and over and over again to humiliate her. And then they showed it with, like, her nipples grayed out on the state television. Like, they humiliated her. And the midwives in Australia participated in her prosecution. 2015, the Purvi Patel case. There was question of whether or not Purvi Patel was a woman who was over 20 weeks pregnant, who may or may not have used Cytotec. someone had said she'd been talking about getting Cytotec. There was no evidence of her taking abortion drugs, but she miscarried at home, and then she didn't know what to do with the baby, with the fetus, and she put it in a Tupperware container, and then she was bleeding a lot, and she went to the hospital without the baby, and a doctor called the cops on her, and she was charged with feticide. And even though it was not clear, like it was hearsay that she had told someone earlier in the pregnancy she didn't want to be pregnant and she might want to get abortion pills in the mail, there was no evidence she had actually done that. She was held in jail for a long time and released with time served. Indiana has a terrible record of arresting women. And then in Tennessee, we saw Anna Yaka, who she was a mentally ill woman who was in an abusive relationship and attempted to abort with a coat hanger. This is where the mythology of the coat hangers really hurts women. You know, having been trained by the second wave feminists who set up underground abortion clinics that were really safe and women were helping each other, they say that mythology was about protecting doctors and legal abortion and the moneyed industry around abortion. But women internalized that, and you have this woman who's mentally unwell and not very educated, and she thinks, well, I need to have an abortion. I've heard you can do it with a coat hanger. She put a coat hanger in her vagina and stabbed herself many, many times. Was hemorrhaging. Her boyfriend ratted her out, and he escaped charges, even though she said he was encouraged it and it helped her by cooperating with the police, and she went to jail for murder. The baby survived, was 26 weeks and has injuries, but the injuries are probably due to prematurity, not from being harmed with the coat hanger. She spent 3 years in jail and then was released on time served. And then Kenlissa Jones was arrested and charged with murder for self-abortion in that year. So that's when we really see it amping up, that the anti-abortion movement for years said, we're not going to go after the women. We're not going to go after the women. We're just going to go after the doctors, the evil doctors exploiting the women, hurting the women. In the mid-2010s, we start to see this amping up of arresting women for self-abortion and the fetal personhood laws being used for that. Okay, so then in 2017, Alabama sentenced Brooke Shoemaker to 18 years in prison for having a stillbirth at 24 weeks. She had a history of methamphetamine use. There were not traces of meth in the baby at the time of the birth. 24 weeks is barely viable. That's questionable. I guess that probably most people would do heroics at that point, but very low survival rate. Unclear whether or not the methamphetamine use had any bearing on the stillbirth, but 18 years in prison. It hasn't been overturned. And typo there, but South Carolina sentences Elizabeth Thompson to 8 years in prison after her stillborn baby tested positive for amphetamines. And that was Adderall, not meth. It's amphetamine. So many people right now have amphetamine deficiency disorder. Neither their brain doesn't produce enough. My brain doesn't produce enough amphetamine, so, but she was using a friend's. You're not supposed to give that during pregnancy, obviously, but it's not illegal, so 8 years in prison. In 2018, Alabama amends the state constitution, giving legal protections to unborn children. Such a creepy phrase, right? The unborn. And then California, a state we think that has good protections for women, sentences Adora Perez to 11 years in prison for manslaughter after she delivered a stillborn infant and hadn't had prenatal care. She didn't turn herself into the authorities to be managed during pregnancy, had a stillborn infant, and went to jail for was sentenced to 11 years. I don't know how much she served. And Oklahoma did the same thing to Sherry Mason, 12 years in prison for not getting prenatal care. Because the fetus's right to be cared for by a doctor.
As if there aren't still birth women who go to standard care.
Yeah, that's in spite of. When a woman doesn't do it, it's because of, yeah. And then 2019, Georgia, where we are right now, passed a law allowing state residents to claim an embryo fetus with a detectable heartbeat as a dependent on their tax forms, get a $3,000 tax credit. And if you've had a pregnancy, have proof that there had been a heartbeat. And they now require the state officials to count fetuses over 6 weeks gestation in the official population count of the state. If there's detectable cardiac motion. And they allow courts to order prenatal child support payments. Again, like like a lot of women think, well, that's good, that's great, but that gives that man control over that woman. It's like, he can, now he's got control over her behavior. And it also allows pregnant women to drive alone in the carpool lane. I know, but it seems like every single woman of reproductive age can just drive in the carpool lane now and just go for it, Right.
If I'm done my hair, I can just get away with
Right,
it.
2020, Oklahoma passes legislation declaring embryos and fetuses can be victims of child abuse and neglect. So again, the court can appoint a guardian ad litem for the fetus.
I'm pregnant, fuck you.
Totally. I wonder how hard they push it. Like if you have to have proof of it, like cops could mess with you. But yeah, totally. Or, like I miscarried on my way to traffic court. So this Oklahoma law is pretty distressing because it allows the court, the Child Protective Services division of the state, to appoint a guardian ad litem for the fetus, for embryos and fetuses, and to dictate the behavior of women during pregnancy. And then Amanda Aguilar was a medical marijuana patient, and she was charged with felony child neglect for using medical marijuana during pregnancy, despite the fact her baby was healthy. And she just dragged through the courts. I don't know if that has been decided yet, but that, again, her doctor ratted her out. And then Emily Akers was sentenced to 10 years in prison for child neglect for having a stillborn infant and not complying with prenatal care. 2021, so Oklahoma's bad. Indiana, Oklahoma, really bad places for pregnant women. South Carolina also. Brittany Pula miscarried at 15 weeks, well before viability, and was charged with second-degree manslaughter because she had admitted in a prenatal appointment to using marijuana when pregnant. There's no evidence marijuana contributes to miscarriage or stillbirth. There is absolutely no evidence that her use of it contributed to that, and she was charged with second-degree manslaughter. That's a big charge. And the Federal Life at Conception Act was introduced. That was during the first Trump administration, where every time the Republicans get some ground, they start really introducing these fetal personhood laws federally. Arizona passed a fetal personhood law, which was later blocked in the courts, and then Texas enacted a Human Life Protection Act. Texas, another bad state. 2022, the Dobbs decision. Supreme Court overturns Roe versus Wade. I'd like to remind people that during that we had the leaking of the decision months and months before the official decision. Right after the decision was leaked, Susan Collins, Republican senator from Maine, pro-choice senator from Maine, introduced a bill in Congress that would have codified the rights of Roe versus Wade and kept the status quo for us, and the Democrats refused to let it go to the floor because they like to use this issue to hold a gun to our heads. Yeah, they could have codified Roe versus Wade federally, and they refused to put her bill on the floor.
It's the only women's rights issue that Democrats will talk about.
Yeah, vote for me or he's going to make you have a rape baby. Mafia. And then Alabama jails Stacey Freeman for allegedly using drugs during pregnancy. Her child told a social worker that her mom was pregnant, and also said sometimes her mom smokes marijuana. The child, like a little child, under 7, they went to her house and jailed her for using drugs during pregnancy, and she wasn't pregnant. She wasn't pregnant. And then finally, like she spent weeks in jail before she could find someone to represent her. And they released her, but the judge said, you will return to jail if you become pregnant over the next 9 months.
What?
It's, yeah, sick stuff. Texas charges Lizelle Gonzalez with murder for self-aborting. They backed off on that because of bad PR, but they're, getting ready to really start this. In Texas, it is almost impossible to get an abortion. A lot of women from Texas are coming to where I live. It's just... Actually, Mexico just legalized abortion. Women are going back to Mexico for abortions. And then in 2022, Ohio denied chemotherapy to a woman because she was pregnant. Because the chemotherapy would hurt the fetus. That's recent stuff. And then we started again seeing more arrests for violating the abortion laws. Nebraska sentenced a mother, Jessica Burgess, to 2 years in jail for helping her daughter obtain abortion pills. And then last year, Brittany Watts in Ohio miscarried, went to the hospital to get care, and they were like, "Where's the baby?" And she's like, "I flushed it down the toilet, like everybody does." And she was charged with abuse of a corpse under the Fetal Personhood laws.
How far along was she?
I don't know. She didn't clog the toilet. Sick women are miscarrying. It's really distressing because that is standard. Like, women flush miscarriages down the toilet every day, all day long in this country.
I miscarried in a public library bathroom very early on.
Yeah.
Like, what would I have done?
What are you going to do? Abuse of a corpse because of the Fetal Personhood laws. Yes, Suzanne.
She went to the doctor. I was just sent in here because the next session is starting
Oh, no.
in the main ballroom.
Okay.
And a suspiciously large amount of people were missing.
Okay. I had no idea it was taking that long. Sorry. Anyway, that's the depressing state of our rights.